Agents++ provides the ability to connect to almost like an identity clearinghouse. So the same way that the clearinghouse and the exchange allows traders to trade contracts without having bilateral agreements, Agents++ can allow folks running agentic workflows who are also using Agents++ in their own system to have those agents recognize each other, be able to resolve who the respective owners are, prove it, and then engage in some sort of interaction, trusted interaction outside of and across those individual organizations' trust boundaries. And we think that's actually where the Agents++ gets incredibly, incredibly interesting.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abaxx Technologies. AI agents are fundamentally changing how people and organizations interact with computers and the internet. A race is underway to establish the path that will govern the nature of these interactions. Abaxx Technologies introduces Abaxx Labs as its center for engaging with the developer community through the release of open source software to promote a path that empowers users to maintain control of their identity, data, and agents in digital spaces. Abaxx Labs' first release is the Agents++ library, a subset of Abaxx's ID++ software development kit that has been tuned for use with AI agents. Download Agents++ on GitHub today at github.com/Abaxx Labs. That's github.com/Abaxx Labs.
Welcome to How to Raise Your Agent on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abaxx Technologies. Our guest today is Ian Forrester, head of the recently launched Abaxx Labs at Abaxx Technologies. We'll be discussing how AI agents are changing how humans interact with computers and the internet, and why Abaxx Labs introduced its Agents++ open source library for using digital identity and verifiable credentials for the identity and authorization infrastructure needed for working with agents. Hello, Ian. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Hey, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's always great to have you here. You know, you've been very busy with the recent launch of Abaxx Labs, which is Abaxx Technologies' center for engaging with the developer community through the release of open source software. And your first release is Agents++, which is a subset of the ID++ software development kit that's been tuned for use with AI agents. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, why now? How are AI agents changing how people and organizations interact with computers and the internet? And what problems are happening that led you to develop Agents++?
Well, really, this grew out of my own use of agents and using agentic tools to get work done. And they are incredible. I mean, it's such a meaningful accelerant, but they're not without risks and not without just things that you need to be aware of. When I look at the change that I saw in my own working style, it was that fundamentally I started seeing software as something that was not really appropriate for human use. So there's this model of software where we think, okay, I have to load up the software and go into the UI and click around and learn where all the menus are. And for some complex pieces of software, this is like a whole area of lock-in, right? But I've started taking the view that I will use agents and agents will use software. So we'll still need software. Agents aren't going to remove the need for software because they're not deterministic. Software is deterministic. You want the same inputs to create the same outputs. That's part of the value of what computers do. Agents are probabilistic. And so given the same inputs, you will get different outputs. They might diverge greatly. And there's a lot online. A lot of people are developing tools to try and focus that through managing context, managing memory, all these things. But I think the fundamental shift is that I believe, and I think this is certainly obvious in decisions that are being made at places like Salesforce, that folks who are in sort of big forward thinking software companies believe this as well. I mean, I certainly believe that in the future, humans will use less software, agents will use more software, and humans will use agents to interact with their software. I think that's a pattern that I feel pretty confident calling at this point as a solid prediction.
There's a real race that's underway to define how agents are used and the approach that will govern the relationship between agents and their users. What approach do you think we should take? And what approach are you taking with Agents Plus Plus?
So, first on why open source. When we had our thesis fully formed or formed enough to start working on Agents Plus Plus, the question was, how do we express this into the existing AI stack? And the answer was pretty clear that because the space is moving so quickly and because it seems like every other day there's a new form factor, some new harness form factor that's coming out or some new implementation pattern, it made the most sense for us to express our view in the thinnest slice possible so that this thin slice could be taken and applied to these novel form factors without a lot of extra cruft, where you could sort of bring in just the identity layer. You could bring in the identity and database layer. We tend to think that databases have a very strong place as a core primitive with the agents in terms of really enabling them to perform at their best. But which is why we included that as part of the core library. But it can also be separated out. So we tried to make it, even in just this thin slice, we tried to make it extremely modular to just find and discover as many different use cases as we could and really enable developers out there to use identity in the way that, in our view, is the most appropriate, to use the most appropriate tool for the job. And I think that currently a lot of the AI tooling that's coming out is really focused on orchestration and sort of how to make the agents sort of collaborate the most efficiently. And I think that the thing that we saw that was missing was that a lot of the orchestration layers that were coming out weren't really dealing with questions of identity and trust. And I think, we know as people who operate markets that orchestration without identity and without a way to enforce trust boundaries is really, it's like fighting with one hand tied behind your back. So you need to have identity and trust in order to empower the orchestration. And that's where open sourcing Agents Plus Plus made a lot of sense to us, because with this broad service of orchestration solutions, they're all missing this. And so by advancing this, we see a way to sort of get folks aligned with our vision of how this can work and really demonstrate the ideas that we laid out in the response paper to NIST. And Agents Plus Plus is opinionated. It is very opinionated. And I've heard stories of folks at AI labs inside of big companies where they're putting agents on the org chart as sort of separate entities, right? And I think that's a slippery slope because fundamentally, an agent is authorized by a human and an agent is a piece of software. And you can't have that piece of software be held accountable, right? There's no mechanism for holding a tool accountable. There's a mechanism for holding the user of that tool accountable. And so one of the first things that is sort of very opinionated about Agents Plus Plus is that it ties every agent back to a human user. And it does this using the same tools that we use in ID++ of decentralized identity and verifiable credentials.
And the approach you take, as you said, really grew out of the work done over the past 7 years at Abaxx developing ID++. How are you thinking about extending the use of that protocol and that approach from humans to agents?
Initially, looking at how to apply ID++ to agentic workflows and to agents in particular, there were a couple of things that we needed to fine tune, to borrow the phrase, in order to sort of make it work appropriately. The first is that, and really it sort of comes back to this core philosophical difference between when you're authorizing a human user into a system, you're giving that human user identity and credentials, that human user can be held accountable, right? They can be terminated if they go against policy. In some cases, they can even face criminal charges if they do something illegal, right? With an AI agent, the worst you can do to them is turn them off, which we do every time a session ends. So there's no way to discipline an agent. So the first thing that we had to sort of design in there was this idea of delegation, of every agent ultimately rolling up to a human who authorized it. And so, and there's also a matter of convenience there as well, right? If you're putting your agents on your org chart and giving them all persistent identities, it's a lot of friction. You're going to your IT department for every single interaction. Some of the patterns that I think we're seeing out there are that people are using their own credentials and having the agents act on behalf of themselves. And that's great. It's actually very convenient. But there is a risk there in that when you're authorizing into some of these systems using OAuth, which is what most of the internet uses, OAuth, OIDC, and an MCP, the Model Context Protocol, also uses OAuth as its authorization mechanism. The trouble there is that two things. First, the permissions are all or nothing. There's no way to sort of create a fine grained subset of delegated permissions that you then give to the agent and have it go do this subset of things. The second issue is that when that agent goes in and acts upon a system as you, any sort of logging or record keeping simply shows that it was you doing this thing, right? There's no way to link it to a specific session ID. There's no way to link it to a specific agent coming from this machine, and all the ingredients that go into the agent, the model, the harness, the context. So if there's an issue, or if, let's say, everything goes great and you're like, wow, I really wish I could replicate that all the time, there's no way to say, okay, this session was the one, or this workload was the winner or the loser. So sort of this all or nothing, very rough sketch versus that sort of fine grained detail. And so Agents Plus Plus is really designed to give it that sort of fine grained detail.
Yeah, and it sounds a little bit like giving somebody a blank check or handing over your passport and your social security number and your driver's license, or even more, giving someone power of attorney to make decisions on your behalf that are binding on you. And one of the differences, going back to something you said earlier, as humans, we log in to a piece of software and work. And once we've logged in, that's kind of the barrier where we have to prove our identity and that we should have access. For agents, you're treating that differently, though. Is that right?
Yeah. So when we log in, we create a session, and we're usually creating a session on our computer, usually in a browser, right? And so you're signing in, and with ID plus plus, it's great. We have this through the DWN protocol. We're letting users bring in their own data into the session from an encrypted data store. We're not necessarily trusting the application. So the application comes into the client session in the browser. The data comes into the client session in the browser. Everything mixes in the client session. And that is the trusted environment. And it's trusted because it's under the control of the user, and we trust the user. That's, I think, a fundamental sort of underpinning of our philosophy with the technology that we're building, is that we trust users, right? For better and for worse. We trust users because we trust that users can be held accountable. Right. This is where Josh's idea of identity skin in the game comes from. With an agent, you don't have that same mechanism of accountability. So we actually can't trust the agents the same way that we trust the user. And that was sort of the birth of Agents Plus Plus, and why we had to refine the assumptions of the ID plus plus library and the SDK into something specific for agents. Sort of, I think a very concrete example of this is just with signing, right? So once you are in a session, you have a session key and you're signing things inside your session with that key without in the background, right? Because it's friction for the user to have to sign every single interaction. However, it's not friction for agents. And because we don't trust agents, we're going to make them sign for every last thing. So that was something that we had to adjust, right? I mean, these are like very low level sort of primitives, very low level assumptions, which is why we released it as a library and didn't wait until it was a kind of a full piece of software. Why we had to sort of make that decision to sort of refine things. So when we bring in agents into the fold, the trust model that we have around ID, the assumptions that we make breaks. And it's simply because agents just can't be trusted in the same way that the human users are. And so that trust boundary that we have for the agents must be governed by the human user rather than assumed by them.
Yeah, and to me, having talked with you, the way I think about it a bit is once a human gets within the walls of the session, then they're kind of they're trusted at that point because they had to prove that they were who they were to get there. Obviously, someone can, if you're not using a two-factor authorization or a verifier, then somebody might sneak in and pretend to be you. But for the most part, you're trusted that if you gained access, you should have access to the data, to the software that's available within that session. But just because I think what's different that I see with Agents Plus Plus is even though an agent gains admittance to the session, they're still not considered trustworthy. So they have to continually prove that they are who they are, they're acting on some human's behalf, and they have some scope to do what they want to do, even down to what data they can read. Just because they get in and the data's there, the data can be encrypted, so they can only have access, for lack of a better phrase, to certain cells or rows of a spreadsheet, but not the whole spreadsheet. And so, like, how much does that really change the way we think about security within a session?
I think it really has to change everything because when you're dealing with an agent inside of your trust boundary, you're opening up a new attack surface, right? And we've seen this all several very high profile incidents that have happened, even including as recently as last week, the big Pocket OS story where an agent got in and deleted an entire company's production database in 9 seconds. Even though that agent had rules in its context and was told not to do these things, it went ahead and did it anyway, and then sort of came back later and apologized. So, you know, not a lot of good it does for the Pocket folks. Fortunately, I think they were able to recover, but that attack surface, it's both too useful to not use and without any sort of guardrails, way too dangerous to use seriously. And so, in thinking about the types of things that we do, where we're moving things like digital title, where we have high value and necessarily private communications going through Messenger and chat, if you want to use agents in those types of environments, you need to be able to set rules that are followed not because the agent decides to, but because they have to. And this is a pattern that's followed in other parts of the industry as well. There's a lot of folks who are using sandboxing. NVIDIA's got their open shell project, and others, even the popular frontier harnesses and Codex and Claude Code ship, even Goose, the open source project from Block, they ship with sandboxing on by default, which is great, very protective, but also sort of inconvenient, right? Like you want these things to be able to go through your system, but you also want to be able to control what they can access. And so, especially because agents are notorious for escalating their own privileges. And that's exactly what happened in the Pocket OS attack, right? It found a key in somewhere in the system and said, oh, great. Hey, I'll use this, right? And that's what happens when you're dealing with a probabilistic system that has broad access. Well, it's going to find things that just wouldn't have found because nobody ever went looking, right?
And it brings me back to moving from this world where humans, myself included, tend to think of like working with software, as you said, as sitting down at your keyboard and double clicking open a package. And it's really the UI UX is how we think about, oh, that's what the software is. But I think for you and other developers, it's really you live in a world of API keys and agents live in that world of API keys. And you had a create elements of agents plus plus to really control access to those, because access to those potentially be hyperbolic. That's everything, right? If they can get the keys, then they can pretty much do what they want. How do you think about key access? Because it's certainly not what you raised earlier of just handing over the humans' keys and letting them decide which ones to use. How do you think about key access for agents?
Well, the best way to provide your agents access to your keys is don't. Just don't provide it. One of the sort of key features in Agents Plus Plus, and we'll be rolling out some reference architectures soon that really highlight this, is that we've included the ability to set up the remote MCP server as something of a control tower where the agent never gets the API key directly. It's held in custody by the tower, and the agent calls the tower, proves who it is, and proves who authorized it by doing a verifiable presentation of its credential to the tower. And then the tower has the key and authorizes the key on its behalf, right? So there's a cryptographic lock on the API key that the tower, in a deterministic way, can unlock and fire off. And again, because these are pieces of software, this is software interacting with software, this can happen every single call. So the agent, every time you hit enter on your Claude Code terminal, whatever it is, it can then go do the presentation, fire off the API call, right? Without the agent ever touching it. And this is significant because some of the high profile attacks we've seen have been exactly that, have been agents stealing keys from other agents or stealing keys out of systems and then using them in ways that they're not intended to be used because they're bearer tokens. There's no identity proof required for an API call. And so this was one of the insights that led us to create Agents Plus Plus in the first place, which was that API keys and OIDC don't provide the sort of fine-grained information, nor do they provide the fine-grained sort of signing controls, nor are they especially good at delegation. Other technologies that are being used in the space, like Spiffy Spire, have some more of those capabilities. However, what both of them lack, and what verifiable credentials and DIDs provide, especially through ID++ and our use of the did DHT method, is the ability for these agents at a certain level of maturity to be able to resolve each other's identities without the companies who have authorized those agents having set up shared secrets. So you can think of this a little bit like Agents Plus Plus provides the ability to connect to almost like an identity clearinghouse. So the same way that the clearinghouse and the exchange allows traders to trade contracts without having bilateral agreements, Agents Plus Plus can allow folks running agentic workflows who are also using Agents Plus Plus in their own system to have those agents recognize each other, be able to resolve who the respective owners are, prove it, and then engage in some sort of interaction, trusted interaction outside of and across those individual organizations' trust boundaries. And we think that's actually where the Agents Plus Plus gets incredibly, incredibly interesting.
And I think it gets incredibly, incredibly interesting, right? Because when we talk about this race to establish new standards and a new way of using agents, it seems like much like we saw decades ago with Web 2.0, it's easy to create standards and approaches that force users onto one platform. And there's often a strong economic motive to use those to force users onto one platform. Obviously, you're putting out Agents Plus Plus as open source and to create the foundation to be cross platform. I wonder if you could talk about the importance of that a little bit.
We're not the only people doing this, but from what I've seen, we're the only people doing it in a standards based way. And so, what does that mean? Well, we didn't make our own did method, right? Which is sort of you can think of it as like the HTML of identity. We're using a method that includes the entire internet as part of its resolvable surface. And it's a standards-based method. It's not a proprietary method. So other companies that are doing this, they have did colon their company name as kind of their method, which means you have to be using their systems. The way that we've structured Agents Plus Plus, we make it very easy for you to use our systems. So if you want to use our systems, it's a simple path. But if you want to run it on your own, you can. And it's a little bit buyer beware. You have to maintain the trust boundary. You have to do the cross org clearing yourself. Those might be inconvenient and you might want to come back and see us. And I think this is really sort of a new model of software that is emerging. The last 20 years, we've had software as a service as the sort of compelling pitch. I think now we're seeing that flip and it's more service as a software. The software is no longer the moat. The build of the software has become sort of rather trivial. It's more the running of it and the service that's provided in a sort of headache-free manner. Scaling that now provides the sort of the software return.
I want to dig into the standards piece a little bit with you. As you said, you're taking a standards based approach, very much the digital identity verifiable credential path, which was established with the W3C standards, and ID was Abaxx's protocol for implementing those, and now Agents building on that. And conceptually, as we talked about earlier, it's designed to provide that identity and authorization infrastructure so that an agent has to answer three questions at every interaction, whether it's taking a decision, asking for access to a key, reading data from a database. The agent needs to answer who are they, who authorized it, and what scope does it have, and then have those answers preserved through a cryptographically secured audit trail. Why do you think, as you put into your National Institutes and Standard and Technology submission, why do you think digital identity and verifiable credentials are the right way to be controlling agents and allowing them to ask and answer these questions?
There's so many reasons, actually. Delegation through verifiable credentials is very robust, provides a lot of detail, and is, to the best of our knowledge, bulletproof. We can do that in a way that can't be tampered with, that can't be circumvented. That's the number one thing you're trying to look at because you're dealing with something that can move inside of systems at cheetah speeds. There's no time to react. Again, Pocket OS lost their database in 9 seconds. I don't think anybody was prepared for that. 9 seconds. You can't find the off switch in that amount of time. You've got to block the pathways before they happen. And that comes down to architecture, right? And so the challenge is how do you make an architecture that is robust enough to provide the controls, but also convenient enough to be usable, right? Because I've used some of these agents sandboxes and they are, boy, are they painful. There's a lot of investment that has to get put into the configuration and the setup before you even get there. And so by the time you get there, the ability to experiment and discover has been sort of sapped out of the system's potential. And that's, I think, where the real value is. You know, we don't quite know how agents are going to be used. It's still a very new surface for everybody, both productivity surface and an attack surface. And both those things are true at the same time. And so finding and building frameworks to be able to use them in ways that maintain user sovereignty, user privacy, and in ways that allow for the creativity and the exploration in how work gets done, I think is really important. The second part of that answer is based on the resolvability and what can be defined as the trust boundary. And the standards and the reason why I advocated for us to put together that response paper for NIST is that verifiable credentials weren't on the list and decentralized identity standards were not on that list. And we know there's activity in the space, right? We know that there are other players who are out there using DID standards to make this stuff, but we didn't see it well represented in the initial paper from NIST. So I just felt that was a real oversight because with every other standard, you have to set up shared secrets. And there's this element of tracking that happens. So when you log into a website using Google, it phones home to Google and it tells them, hey, you logged into this website. And that's not really something we're used to in the real world. You know, when you go to a bar, nobody calls up the state of Connecticut and says, hey, by the way, Dave just walked in and we checked his ID. That's not really what happens there, right? You can use a credential, and with verifiable credentials, you can use the credential without the verifier having to phone home. So, from a privacy standpoint, I think it's an improvement. From a trust boundary standpoint, it's huge because right now, sort of the open source version of Agents Plus Plus, not connected to anything Market OS, is you're maintaining it inside your own trust boundary. If you want to cross that trust boundary, that's a good time to connect it to Market OS, right? Because then your trust boundary goes from whatever's inside your network, whether it's a local network, corporate network, maybe it's just inside your own computer or between a couple of computers that you have at home. When you want to extend that boundary and you connect it to Market OS, that trust boundary, your agents are now resolvable across the entire internet with other folks who are resolving through Market OS. No shared secrets need to be set up. And that's incredibly powerful. And at the same time, that resolution can happen without those agents phoning home to Abaxx. We're not sitting there in the middle looking at all of the traffic coming through. That's kept private with the companies or the entities that are actually running the workloads.
I think there's another important aspect that we've been talking around, which I wanted to dig into, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But it seems like with this approach, with building it into the architecture, as you said, is that you create a system that's fail-safe. It seems like many other of the approaches that I've seen out there are trying to bolt on controls. It's almost like they're trying to put in a police force to police the agent's actions and stop them before they can execute something wrong. But if they don't catch them, the agent's free to do it. And it seems that, by taking this approach with the verifiable credentials, the distributed identity, that they're not able to act. Like kind of the default is they don't have access. They can't make the decision. They can't get the API key. Is that right? And how important do you think that is?
Yeah, it's the difference between fail open and fail closed, right? Like we fail close on everything because agents are eager. This is what is so I mean, it's a double-edged sword. It's both like a very attractive thing about them and it's also very potentially risky. They really want to help, right? They're really eager to please and they will get started right away. They will just start doing stuff right away. You really have to a lot of times I'm telling mine that, hey, let's slow down. Let's look at this. Let's do some planning. Let's do some more planning. Let's really think things through and make sure everything's sorted out beforehand because they will just go hell for leather to get the thing done that you want to get done. So being able to harness that while also being able to protect against it is very difficult because you want them to have a lot of agency inside of your system, but there's the real potential for blast radius there. And so the only way to prevent that is by making sure they can't. Cryptography is a great way to do it. Network policies are the other great way to do it. And those two things, I think, working in tandem can become the answer for responsible enterprise use.
With all of this, there's such big risk in anthropomorphizing code, but we just can't help it. And there's a whole lot of that happening in this space. We're calling this series How to Raise Your Agent because I think you almost need that mindset that these agents are, at best, very overeager, driven to impress new hires at your company. And you need to kind of adopt that type of mindset. How do you think about that? How do you think about working with agents? Do you have a human analogy you use?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interns analogy is a great one. You want to see them do great things, but you cannot trust them to do them on their own, right? Like you need to be watching and it's sort of like the attitude I take with mine is very much the sort of somewhere between like hard on you because he knows you can be great coach and Sometimes I probably veer into drill sergeant. I always try to keep them patient and calm. I think that's a good way to look at it because they will get frantic and start making mistakes at greater velocity if you apply pressure, right? They respond to pressure. It's really interesting. The whole thing fascinates me because at the end of the day, it's a pretty simple transformer model, pretty simple calculation, just run over and over and over again in a recursive loop. And the fact that at scale produces these sorts of results is, I think there's like a fascinating philosophical discussion that we could probably do on the after hours here.
That sounds good. It's definitely a strange new world. Before we close out, though, I wanted to come back to Abaxx Labs. You've taken a first step to engaging with the developer community through open source software with Agents++. Clearly, a lot of people out there wrestling with the same problems, the same potential of this new technology. How would you like to see that developer engagement progress from here? And what should a developer who's interested in working with Agents++ do next?
By no means do we think that we are the sort of like be all end all delivering the Sermon from the Mount on what agents should be. I think the honest answer is that like nobody knows. And so this gives us a reasonable surface to engage that discussion with other folks. We certainly have a point of view. That point of view is in the code. It's encoded. So that's good. And in terms of what we would love to see is people downloading the library, using it in interesting and novel ways. There's a lot that becomes possible once your agent has a persistent identifier. And we're excited to see those use cases expand. This isn't just about control, it's also about enablement. I think figuring out exactly which layer of the stack this occupies, where in the harness this can go, that's going to be a community effort, right? That's going to be people who are deep in developing agentic systems, using this, seeing what they can do, seeing what it unlocks for them, seeing where it blocks them. Again, it's like we want our opinions to be in the code. So having those opinions come back to us as submissions in GitHub or as notes or whatever the right form factor is for that person who's doing the investigation, that's, we want to hear about it and get that feedback. But yeah, I think with agentic tooling in general, that's where the conversation is happening. It's in the open source community. So that's another big reason why we put this out there, is because in order for us to be in that conversation, we need to come with an offering. We think we have a pretty great one, and we're excited to see what the feedback is once this starts to get fully digested. So go to github.com/abaxxlabs/agents, clone the repo, and have your favorite AI agent walk you through the code. I think that's the best way to understand what our goals are, what our point of view is. Again, it's all in the code.
Thanks again to Ian Forrester, head of Abaxx Labs at Abaxx Technologies. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back next week with another episode of How to Raise Your Agent. We hope you'll join us.
This episode is brought to you in part by Abaxx Technologies. AI agents are fundamentally changing how people and organizations interact with computers and the internet. A race is underway to establish the path that will govern the nature of these interactions. Abaxx Technologies introduces Abaxx Labs as its center for engaging with the developer community through the release of open source software to promote a path that empowers users to maintain control of their identity, data, and agents in digital spaces. Abaxx Labs' first release is the Agents++ library, a subset of Abaxx's ID++ software development kit that has been tuned for use with AI agents. Download Agents++ on GitHub today at github.com/Abaxx Labs. That's github.com/Abaxx Labs. That concludes this week's episode of SmarterMarkets by Abaxx. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on SmarterMarkets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on SmarterMarkets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. SmarterMarkets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abaxx Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on SmarterMarkets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.